Good evening, everyone. My name is Fred Harris, and I am Professor of Political Science and Director of the Institute for Research on African American Studies at Columbia University, and I would like to welcome all of you here on what will be, for sure, a very provocative roundtable titled The Future of Black Churches. The Institute for Research in African American Studies, also known as IRAAS, is Columbia University's African American Studies program. It is a program that envisions its mission as a site of critical engagement for social transformation. This evening, IRAAS, along with Columbia University's Institute for Religion, Culture, and Public Life, brings to you a distinguished panel of academics and ministers of the faith to engage one of the most critical questions facing Black communities, the future of Black churches. The question before us is the Black church dead? And this question was of much debate this past spring when one of our panelists, Princeton religion professor Eddie Glaude, wrote an editorial in the Huffington Post proclaiming the death of the Black church. As we will hear in a moment, this death, according to Professor Glaude, has been caused by the decline of the prophetic tradition in Black religion and the rise of the prosperity gospel, greater differentiation in Black communities in which Black churches no longer have a centralized role in Black life, as well as to the decline of Black church leadership on the national stage. Now, Professor Glaude's proclamation of the death of the Black church has met with sharp criticism from ministers, everyday lay people, and academics who study Black religion, and whose comments have been featured on blogs, on YouTube, the New York Times, National Public Radio, among a variety of public spaces. Indeed, several of those critics are part of this evening's roundtable. Now, in order to respond to the question of whether the Black church is dead, IRAAS wanted to bring together men and women in the ministry who lead some of the nation's distinguished pulpits, as well as leading academics in the field of African American religion. The Institute's own Joseph Surette, who's Assistant Professor of Religion and African American Studies at Columbia, will moderate the panel. Before he moderates, I want to give a very short introduction of our panelists. So when I call your name, I know you guys are famous, but everyone in the audience may not know you, so just raise your hand. Reverend Otis Moss III, Senior Pastor of Trinity United Church of Christ in Chicago. He's a graduate of Morehouse College and received the Master of Divinity from Yale University Divinity School. Reverend Moss has done extensive research in the areas of African American culture, theology, and youth development. 4G published his first book, Redemption in a Red Light District, in December of 1999. The African American Pulpit Journal recently named Reverend Moss one of the 20 to watch ministers who will shape the future of the African American church. The Reverend Dr. Ebony Marshall. She currently serves as Assistant Minister for Christian Education, Dean of Abyssinian Institute for Christian Education, and Editor-in-Chief of Abyssinian Spirit, the church's quarterly publication. Dr. Marshall received her undergraduate degree from Fordham University and completed graduate study at Union Theological Seminary and the Institute for Research in African American Studies through Columbia University School of Continuing Education. In 2009, Dr. Marshall was named one of the network journal's 40 Under 40 for her outstanding leadership in the African American community. On Sunday evenings, I understand, Dr. Marshall is often heard on New York's 98.7 KISS AM, preaching from the pulpit of Abyssinia Baptist Church. Aubrey Hendricks. is professor of Biblical Interpretation, New York Theological Seminary, and is visiting scholar at the Institute for Research in African American Studies. Professor Hendricks is one of the nation's most provocative and innovative commentators on the intersection of religion, politics, and social policy in America. Dr. Hendricks is the author of The Politics of Jesus, Rediscovering the True Revolutionary Nature of Jesus' Teaching and How They Have Been Corrupted. He is a graduate of Princeton Theological Seminary and Princeton University, where he received his doctorate in religion. Eddie Glaude is William S. Todd Professor of Religion and African American Studies at Princeton University. He also serves as the chair of the Center for African American Studies at Princeton. He is a graduate of Morehouse College, Princeton University, and is the author of an award-winning book, Exodus, Religion, Race, and Nation in Early 19th Century Black America. He is also co-author with Professor Cornel West of an anthology of African American religious thought. Last and certainly not least, Professor Anthea Butler, who is Associate Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. She completed her doctoral studies at Vanderbilt University and is the author of the path-breaking book, Women in the Church of God in Christ, Making of a Sanctified World. Professor Butler has also been featured on NPR's Morning Edition, Speaking of Faith, News and Notes, to Today's Show, and the History Channel. She regularly blogs for Religion Dispatches on topics that include religion and politics, religion and popular culture, religion and sexuality. And so now we're here from our moderator, Professor Surratt, who received his undergraduate degree from Oral Roberts University, his doctorate in African American Studies from Harvard University, and one of our rising stars in the Institute for Religion and African American Studies at Columbia. Thank you.
Let's give our introductor, Fred Harris, a hand. I want to thank IRAAS as well as IRCPL again for their co-sponsoring this event, as well as Serene Jones and Union for Theological Seminary for hosting our conversation. I would just add in Professor Harris's understated way the important role of his work in pushing the conversation forward on African American religion. His book, now a decade old, Something Within, on religion and black politics, pre-Obama, if you will. So I thank Fred for the vision for this work and for this panel and for this distinguished group of panelists. It's my pleasure to play the role of moderator. Prior to jumping right into the conversation, I don't want to offer any more preliminary remarks. Professor Harris has done that well. Just want to offer a word around logistics. We will begin with a general question that will allow each of the panelists to offer a brief, concise, clear, provocative 5-minute response. And I have note cards over here to help us along, but I have no concern about time. And after those initial remarks, we will have a time of about 30 to 40 minutes of follow-up question and conversation, after which we will turn to a broader engagement with all of you, and we very much appreciate and want to have a larger conversation this evening. And to make the most productive use of that time, to get as many questions and points before our panelists, we have already begun to circulate. I want to thank Nkosi Anderson, who has taken leadership in distributing the cards, and he will, along with several other union students, be collecting those cards. So ask that as something is said that sparks a question, a concern for you, that you would write it down. And if, Nkosi, if you could stand up along with the folks who are helping you, and they will be accessible and make themselves visible throughout the time so that you can get your card to them ASAP, and they will present the questions to our audience when we move to the time of question and conversation, okay? So, Fred has set us up quite well for a discussion on the life and death of the Black church, and we will actually proceed in the exact reverse order of the introductions, in alphabetical order, if you will. So we will turn to Dr. Butler, followed by Dr. Glaude, Dr. Hendricks, Reverend Dr. Marshall, and Reverend Moss, and we look forward to the conversation. Beginning in a general sense, allowing each of you to take this in whatever direction you want, we presume that because we are all here, at least in some capacity, Black churches are living and breathing, doing different sorts of work. Would ask for each of you to open up the conversation by identifying and elaborating upon just one thing that you see as a major pressing issue that Black churches are currently addressing or need to do a better job of addressing, something that Black churches are wrestling with in this current moment.
Thank you all for having me here. I think about this question a lot in part because of being a historian and looking at the Black church through a historical lens. I'd say there's one word that I think about a lot, and that word is community. Community is what the black church does well in one respect, but what it needs to be doing better in another. And let me explain briefly. And I got to tip my hat to Professor Harris on this one because we've had some conversations on this. If you think about a black church now in an internal community of believers, a community that is located in one church, you can think that there's a pastor, there are people on the board, there are deacons, there are elders, there are members of the church, there's church mothers, and within that community is cohesive, that community of individuals. It's a safe place for people. It's a place where you can tell people your problems. It's a place where you can call out to God. What the problem is that most of our churches now are individual churches, and they are not collectives as a community within the communities that they live in. And I think this has a lot to do with the kinds of black churches we have now. It's not just a moderate 100-member church or a 200-member church. We have mega churches of 10 or 20,000. We have small storefront churches of 100 or 200. But the thing that usually brings people together is that you have a set of shared common goals. During the civil rights movement, it was civil rights. Now that things have sort of dissipated into all sorts of ills of the urban community especially, how do you bring community together? How do you bring communities of churches together? How do you bring coalitions together? Part of the way that happens is you may make a community of churches or a pastor's coalition or something like that. These things are going away. The second thing, and I think that a big moment that happened that a lot of people probably didn't realize, but it was a very big moment, was the passing of Dorothy Height. And when Dorothy Height passed, what that was a generation going away. You had the National Council of Negro Women, you had sororities, you had fraternities. All these things have had a connection to black churches. But these organizational structures don't exist anymore. And so where you could have linkages between churches and sororities and fraternities and all these things that make up the black community, they don't exist. Those connections are broken. And because the connections are broken, there's not a sense of community anymore. And how do you continue to perpetuate yourself? How do you perpetuate when your internal church community might be 65 and older and no way to replicate itself? There's no one to come in. How do you continue to perpetuate yourself if you don't have like-minded organizations to come alongside you to help you fight for things in that urban space? How do you continue to perpetuate yourself when your membership is dwindling or your members take their part of their tithes and offerings and give it to that nice TV preacher on TV every Sunday? So you can see that the structures that held everything together don't exist very well anymore.
Thank you, Brother Joseph and Brother Fred and all of you for joining us in what I hope will be a very powerful and insightful conversation. So let me try to jump into it rather directly. I think what most churches do very well, and I don't know if they need to do better in advertising that they do this well, is that they tend to souls. That folk come in to the sanctuary, they come in to experience the power of worship, and in communion with others find affirmation and experience as best as possible the grace and mercy of God, which can be for some, and I hope for most, renewing. And so when we think about this priestly function of churches, primarily directed at that dimension of human living that is not reducible to our social and political activity, I think the church or churches do a very, very good job at this. In addition, I think churches, and I'm going to get more excited as we go on. I won't bore you to death, I promise. I'm just kind of tired. Does that make sense? I am tired, though. Another thing that churches do well, many churches, and you know this because many of you pastor them, is that they stretch a dollar in relation to the needs of their constituents. So many churches are They have soup kitchens. They have prison ministries. They are trying to address the foreclosure crisis that's impacting their membership. They are dealing with folks whose lights have been turned off. They are, in interesting sorts of ways, addressing the day-to-day circumstances and conditions of the folk who come to be nourished spiritually, but they can't be nourished spiritually if they are not living decent lives in the context of their day-to-day activity. And I think churches, for the most part, many local churches are doing wonderfully in this regard. I think the question for us to wrap our minds around is, what is its national role? How do we think about what it means that Progressive Baptist Convention isn't as powerful as it used to be? How do we think about the function of like-minded persons in the faith addressing directly conditions that are not just reducible to those who sit in the pews? Progressive voices, prophetic voices. I want to make the claim that there's no inherent prophetic orientation in any church. I just want to be very clear. To me, it's an oxymoron to think of an institution that's prophetic. It's just, and we can debate that. I hope we do. And so part of what I think is that when we look at it at a micro level, many churches are doing what they've been called to do. When we think about, and we can talk about this in an interesting sort of way in terms of the challenges that they face. When we think about it at a macro level, I want to have a more careful conversation, and we can look at the data and start talking about what that means in its detail.
Yeah, thank you. I'm very glad to be here. And let me say first that I speak as a son of the church and a former president of a theological seminary, and as a former member of the general board of an historic black denomination. I speak as an insider. And so that gives me the right to speak honestly, and more so, it gives me the responsibility to speak honestly. Eddie made some points that I think are good ones. Churches are good at the empathic. They're good at what we might call tending souls. And he spoke also of spiritual nourishment. But I'm not sure, there is a nourishment of the spirit. I'm not sure that I'd call it a spiritual nourishment, though, at the same time. Because what I see is that there is a lack of a tradition of interiority in our churches. What I mean by a lack of a spiritual, of a tradition of interiority, I mean a tradition by which we inculcate and we engage spiritual disciplines in order to grow in a higher God consciousness, rather than taking us to a cul-de-sac of something called faith, that I have faith now, I am saved, but a tradition of interiority that sees us being on a path, on a way to a higher God consciousness. And we get a sense of that, I think, in the Gospel of Luke. I think it's modeled when after Jesus has been baptized and initiated into the mission that would take him through his ministry and to his death. After that, he goes into the desert, and he engages in spiritual ministrations and disciplines to prepare himself. He engages in solitude and in silence and in prayer, but also meditation, because when you're in the desert for 40 days, there aren't but so many words for you to repeat. You must be going inward. And even if it's words, then it becomes mantras, and that becomes meditative as well. He engaged in contemplation. It was then, only then, after he had gone through this deep wellspring and time of spiritual preparation, only then would he stand and say, now I am ready. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor, which would have to be structural change, because then it wouldn't be good news to the poor, because some folk would still be poor. Liberation to the oppressed, and in that sense, he had prepared himself spiritually to be engaged in the world, and in that way he exemplified what I've called holistic spirituality, and in a very unique Jesus, in a very unique proclamation, unique, and the earliest we see is unique, and the earliest we see in the documentary evidence anyway, that no one else had conflated this verse from Deuteronomy and verse from Leviticus to say, love your Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. What I'm getting at is that with the lack of a tradition of interiority, which is different from the tradition of exteriority, which means we're always singing, we're always preaching, we're always performing. We're not listening for the still small voice of God. I'm suggesting a tradition of interiority is lacking because there's nowhere in our traditional worship where we can really have a meditative time, where we sit in meditation, tarrying for the Spirit like the old folk used to do. We have moments of meditation at times, but that's usually at the end of the service when the choir is processing out. I see this as a real lacuna in black worship, and I don't see it being addressed as fully as it could be or should be. And quite the contrary, I see it getting worse. We're getting more involved in the performative. In terms of preaching, it's more important how you say it quite often than what you're saying. Choirs are deeply into the performative. You don't just sing, but you got to sing. And, preachers talk about burning the house down and tearing the house up and that kind of thing. And so emotionality becomes a proxy for spirituality. I think this is something that we're really going to have to address if we are to be as relevant as we could be, if we're really to lift up what we call saving souls, which becomes something experiential, very experiential normatively, rather than it being a creedal affirmation. These are the things I think that are really lacking in black churches generally. There are some exceptions, of course, but that we're going to have to incorporate in the 21st century for churches to really realize the full depth of their promise and to be, in my opinion, much more consistent with the witness of the gospel witness of Jesus. And I end on this note. If I were allowed to say two things I was concerned about, the second would be that I'd like to see churches more concerned with reading the gospel and less concerned with all kinds of proclamations about all kinds of creedal proclamations and all kinds of performances of piety, being more concerned about reading the Gospels. And I didn't say New Testament, I said the Gospels, because right now we read Paul, and because he's so concerned about personal piety. And that takes us off the hook. But the prophetic witness of Jesus, a greater focus on the prophetic ministry of Jesus and witness of Jesus is the second thing I would mention if I were allowed to do so.
If you were allowed.
Yes.
I approach this topic, the question of whether the black church is dead, is the black church dead, from the perspective of womanist theoethics. And therefore, my womanist analysis has led me to pick up on Glaude's immediate assertion in his proclamation of the black church's death, of the black church, and I quote, as we've known it or imagined it. And he contends, or rather this assertion contends that the communal memory, which undergirds the conceptualization of the black church, corresponds always with what really happened. And what womanist theoethical analysis would suggest is that the conceptualization of the black church does not always correspond with what really happens in black churches. In other words, depending on whose experience is solicited Afro-Christianity has never been monolithic. The black community has never been undifferentiated, and black prophetic witness has always been compromised. These things are not new, therefore the question for me rightly emerges, how can something be dead if it never really was alive, according to the aforementioned assumptions of its former vitality? And still, the black church, though it has never been all it has confessed to be and been confessed as the image of the black church as all of these things, as a homogenous institution for black people on the side of justice and equality, has undoubtedly served as a significant site, as my co-panelists have already mentioned, where many oppressed have come to believe in the God of justice and the God of love. And although justice and love is not always its reality, it is not always the reality of the black church, this reality of justice and love does not die, even when it faces the trickery of a hegemonic imagination that attempts to make us believe that we are dead, even when life is a proximate possibility. As one who lives and breathes the ebb and flow of the black church tradition in her everydayness, it appears to me that the critical question that confronts us tonight is not so much whether the black church is dead, but more importantly, how the image of the black church, as it has been fictively conceived, can be actually realized. That is, how can the black church really live beyond what has been presented as its chronic dis-ease? For example, sexism, heterosexism, pigmentocracy or colorism, ageism, class stratification, and more generally, its apparent obsolete witness in a postmodern world that is no longer dictated by the caustic boundaries of black and white, but rather is colored and nuanced in various shades of gray identities. For the black church tradition, the critical gospel work of affirming life amidst ostensible death requires that we who have given our lives to this high calling must not merely address to seek the women's problem, the woman's problem over there, or seek to address the sexuality problem over there, or the class problem right here. Rather, our call is to address a more primary problem that is situated as the crux of all, I would argue, death-dealing body injustice that emerges from within and is too often endorsed by the black church, namely the problem of male normative identity. In other words, who do you think you are? Is the identity question that the black church must wrestle with in order to propel a reassessment of the black male normativity which functions in black churches toward the end of disregarding the value and the moral agency of all those, male, female, and otherwise, who defy that presumptuous brand of embodied perfection. The future of the institution, born at the interstices of abolition and enslavement, born in rebellion against the social morality that sanctioned the dehumanization and further demonization of black bodies, is dependent then upon its willingness to acknowledge and to respond to the consanguinity of oppressions, which enables the proliferation of moral scapes that inevitably leave somebody out. The black church must instead embrace a body ethic which engenders justice for everybody and not just some of them.
I would just add to that. Ditto. And we'll move on. But it's Zora Neale Hurston that states in her book, Their Eyes Are Watching God, there's the scene that I love so very much where Janie and Tea-Cake, after the storm in the Everglades, the statement is, it seems as if they are staring in the darkness, but their eyes are watching God. Depending upon who is looking at them, it looks after they've been through this incredible storm, that they can only be staring in the darkness after all of this dysfunction and challenges. And the reality is for the black church is it is a model of humanness and dysfunction that struggles with priestly and prophetic. Not one or the other, but it's constantly struggling with the priestly and prophetic, constantly struggling with the private, personal, and also the public. The great challenge for, as we communicate and talk about the church tonight, is simply this. Not is the church no longer prophetic, but the fact that the postmodern church has been overshadowed by prosperity ministry. If anything is killing or destroying the black church, it might be the word network, but that's a whole other discussion in many ways. And so what I feel that the thing that we need to deal with is really talk about the overshadowing of the priestly and the prophetic. And at some point, every church within a community context is going to have to struggle with the priestly and prophetic aspect of its ministry. If you were talking about southern churches in, say, for example, Fort Valley, or we're talking about someplace in Mississippi, some of the best work in terms of working with black farmers is with the church. Or after the BP oil spill, because the community context necessitated that we deal with these issues, not because we're standing up and we want to operate out of prophetic tradition, but because our members are struggling with these issues, and therefore we must engage these issues. So we move from priestly into the prophetic mode. But as a result of the deregulation in America and the decentralization, we have seen decentralization and deregulation in the black church in many ways. So the models that we have imagined that had an impact, the Baptist Convention, they never had an impact. It was an imagined. We imagined it. What happened is that people broke from those particular groups and said that we recognize the pressure upon us and our communities to make transformative communication and change within our community. And so I think that we need to begin to shift how we view the church, because we have an imagined, fictitious idea of what the church is. And then the reality is that there is always a remnant or a fragment that is prophetic that puts pressure upon the church to make a shift in a direction. But we never want to make this bifurcation where priestly is bad, prophetic is always good. But it must be both and. It must be the interior and the exterior. And part of the challenge is now we have people who are claiming the prophetic, but all they're doing is modeling an unrestricted capitalistic model of ministry. And so that we have to have these discussions about what is it to be prophetic, what is it to be priestly, and we are seeing the overshadowing of prosperity ministry and overshadowing of people who are theological exotic dancers and all of that in terms of what they're presenting. And the media, in many ways, of what we have seen, because word network, that's a whole other personal issue I got, with such networks such as this, where we think the model is the theological exotic dancing, when in actuality the real work of the church is not happening necessarily in the big mega churches, but it's happening in churches that are 75 and less, and people who are doing incredible work on the ground. But is it national? No, because just like all politics are local, all churches are local. And we have to come to that idea that most of the movements that we imagine that had an incredible national fervor and power were always local. The Montgomery Improvement Association is a local group. The Southern Christian Leadership, it was a local group. The SNCC, local group. And we have to begin to look from the perspective of local actually is how we go global.
Excellent, excellent. Well, thank you, panelists, for your opening remarks. I want to, in many ways, Otis, your final comment and clarifying this distinction between the priestly and political is something, the priestly and the prophetic is something that runs throughout, I think, all of our panelists' initial remarks, and this is the kind of dual heritage of black churches as spiritual and social institutions, spiritual and political. And I want to ask a first question about the spiritual, and then a second to more clarify this political, this prophetic, and get a couple of you to chime in on either. So if we think about the spiritual first, it's perhaps less told story, right? This political narrative tends to dominate the way we think about the black church, the black church. Aubrey has already suggested some kind of spiritual substance that was at the center of his critique, right? This call for interiority. I'm interested to hear, is it this interiority? Is it this a truer reading of the Bible? What is the substance of the Christian in the Blackened Christian as it's being reimagined? So any two takers that might offer us some hopeful glimpses or some more further clarification of what the substance is of the spiritual in black churches. Or should I?
What it is or what it should be.
What it is or what it might be, what it should be.
Well, I mentioned it, so I'll take a stab. Again, I think that the definitive statement, when we talk about the church, as I said, I think one of the problems is that we don't pay enough attention to the things Jesus said and take them to the nth degree and get into the depth that we might. He said, I think his paradigmatic statement of spirituality, his holistic spirituality, is love your Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. You can't have a cross without them both. And this was unique to him. So spirituality, I think, to be true spirituality, the question is, if we accept that as holistic spirituality, as a valid definition of spirituality in the gospel context. Question is, are we seeing this holistic spirituality in our churches? And I think it's a question that can answer itself. Now, the genius of the prophetic mind was that it laid as the plumb line of all our activity, personal and collective, justice, mishpat, justice. Mishpat v'sadaka, justice and righteousness, but these had to do with actions. And so when we look at the horizontal axis, love your neighbor as yourself, that is tied to the prophetic witness, our responsibility. We love our neighbor as ourselves, and we want to struggle against injustice as they do. So, not everyone has the same resources. And Otis is correct. Not everyone's faced with the same struggle. But in order for it to be holistic spirituality, I'm suggesting it has to be part of the teaching. The prophetic must be part of the teaching of the responsibility. And in too many churches, it just is not.
Teaching ministry
of the preaching, the proclamation. It cannot that always has to be at least taught. It has to be acknowledged. The horizontal axis of what it means to love our neighbors as ourselves, rather than just as some sentiment, give someone a holy hug, and then go on your way the same way. So if we look at it that way, as I recall your question, you say, do we see that? Are we seeing that in the church?
What is the substance, the source that guides the spirituality how do we put some flesh on the bones?
I'm suggesting that should be one of the basic, if not the basic, notion of spirituality guiding us in the spirit. Spirituality is not what you feel, it's how you act. The only true evidence is how we act in the world. So to the extent that we put more emphasis on the vertical than on the horizontal, to the extent that in my understanding that we're not fully understanding or practicing holistic spirituality, therefore I wouldn't say that it's not full spirituality, and therefore not completely consistent with the gospel witness, in my opinion, and my reading.
Did anybody have questions?
I just want to say that it seems to me in agreement with Dr. Hendricks that the substance of our spirituality as the black church would be the gospel, and the problem is that that is not the case in so many contemporary church contexts, that when we look at the gospel, we recognize that there's a mediating ethic at work throughout the gospel. There is no priestly without the prophetic. Jesus goes away to restore himself so that he might come back into the streets and do his ministry amongst the people. So what we see now contemporarily is this, quasi-gospel or this non-gospel at work in so many church contexts where people just want to be, as one of my professors would often say, so heavenly bound that they're no earthly good. and, are looking for cathartic release within their sanctuary sacred time, instead of really melding or really adhering to the gospel witness, which, in my opinion, should be the thrust of our spiritual witness.
I mean, I think one way to concretize it would be to think about this extraordinary moment in Al Raboteau's slave religion, when the slave Mort, who prayed 3 times a day, was confronted by the slave master. And the slave master said, "If you do not stop praying, I will blow your brains out." And the slave Mort responded, "You may own my body, but God owns my soul." Now, for some people, that's an otherworldly gesture.
Right.
But in the context of this account, it has this worldly implications, yes? It is reflective of a relationship with God that fundamentally reorients the self and short-circuits a master-slave relationship, which leads Mort to be maladjusted to a particular political, social, economic relation. But what's interesting is that too many people come out of churches and seem to be very much adjusted to the relations that define the world. And so if people aren't saying you must be drunk, right? Remember in Acts, right? They must be drunk. They must be full of a new wine. If folk aren't actually seeing Christians, in my view, and I know some people say, well, how in the hell is he talking about this? Pragmatic naturalists, Catholic rearing folk. These are some of the things that have been said to me by Christian folk. Folk who've been taking me to the altar, but not for prayer. And the sense is that there is this notion that one could actually encounter the power and ineffable experience of God's grace and not be transformed and enter into the world in such a way that you could be all right with the way it is, then it seems to me that calls for an indictment. It calls for a response. And the response has to be, at least within the Christian context, on Christian grounds. Right? And it seems to me that if we wanted to give some substance, it seems to me if we want to measure the substance of a Christian faith, it's your relative maladjustment to the world in which you actually
And I think that you raise a good question, Eddie, because one of the issues is that within the Christian context, we have a lot of faith. We have a lot of doctrine, but our faith is not connected to love, and love is transformative. So one thing that I heard William Sloane Coffin said is that you have to be careful when you're talking about faith or critiquing people that have deep faith, because they have deep faith, but the problem is that they don't have love. When you have deep faith without love, then you create doctrine that is destructive. And so people who've been taking you to the altar have deep faith about what they believe, hold on to what they believe, but love causes you to wrestle with issues. And so that becomes the central aspect of the gospel, the idea of love. And that becomes the love ethic that we within the church have not engaged. Because one, within the American context, we don't like the word love because love deals with forgiveness, love deals with compassion, all these other ideas. We like faith because faith allows us to operate out of a doctrine that can be rigid in terms of our connection to people. So I don't have to shift with my faith, but love causes me to change the way I look at my faith. And that is what the gospel demands. So here you have this context of Jesus, who is now saying that I want you to operate with this love ethic. But yet we are preaching not love, or better yet, we preach Jesus, but we don't preach what Jesus preached, is really what is happening. And so there needs to be, in many ways, for us to bring back the love ethic central to the ministry that then allows us to develop on the interior and the exterior. Because you have a lot of people who are incredibly prophetic, but yet they are spiritually anemic. And so they are the people that can be an architect for a movement, but yet in their personal lives, they are destructive. And then you have people who are so high and mighty, but they don't want to do anything about shifting things in a public nature. So there's always the tension, and essentially in humanity, we have a dysfunctionality that we have to come to grips with, and that love ethic is one way that we begin to deal with those tensions.
If I could add one qualifier, Anthea, and if you could weigh in, and if there's a way to connect this, all of our departures for the spirituality have been the Bible, right, or have been the Gospels. But I'm wondering, right, Otis, in your initial comment, you claim Zora Neale Hurston. Ebony, you make appeal to a womanist ethic. Is the Gospel the only sacred text? So in particular, Anthea, in your work on Kojic women, right? What are the texts that are informing the spirituality then that animates outwards? Is it just the gospel? And I appreciate that claim as a call for Christian faith, but what are the other texts that we hold sacred?
I said God's grace. I didn't say that.
What text do we hold sacred? The text of discipline.
Oh.
Okay? And I was sitting here listening to a conversation. It's very rare that I'm quiet, okay? But if I'm quiet, that's a dangerous thing.
Hello.
I'm minded to think about a whole nother constituency altogether, which are a lot of my friends, and apparently to the Pew Forum is a lot of people too, and that is all these people who claim to be spiritual but not religious, and the people who are black and Christian and hate the church and don't want to go back no more. And you see what happens is that this text of no love, but we're going to preach to you about the faith, has driven a whole bunch of people up out the door of the church.
That's right.
Okay, and I don't want to take a show of hands in here because I know some of y'all love God in here, but you ain't trying to go in no church. There you go, okay? So, this is the thing. We have to get real about what's really happening. And what's really happening is we got some black churches with folks sitting in them, but the people that we need to have in them, younger people, the people who will keep these things going, they're not there because they are sick of the crap. They are sick of being told what to do, how to do it by people who are hypocritical, who don't have love for nobody, who ain't trying to share their wealth with nobody, who will bother to tell you that your sexuality and your personhood is not worthy because they are the ones up in the pulpit and you are down there. Now, that's not everybody. I'm not here to critique, who's good and who's bad. But we need to realize that there are a large group of African Americans right now who ain't never gonna set foot in a black church again because of how they got raised and what happened to them. And we need to contend with those people who have not been loved, who did not hear anything about the gospel that was good, and decided that the moment they could get away from mama and grandmama, they were gone.
All right.
Just saying.
She had to get that one out.
Well put.
You got people remembering.
To shift just slightly, not to assume that the spiritual and the social are mutually exclusive, but to move from that first half, thinking about the spiritual legacy, to this question of the prophetic and the political. And as many of you even pointed out, that this over-determined political narrative does not take full recognition of the work that black churches have always done, right? Y'all ready to go? Still, we are calling, right? Even in Eddie's initial post on Huffington in the spring was the reassertion of the prophetic, right? So now if we've wrestled with this spiritual a little bit, its shortcomings and insights, what sources inform it, what about the prophetic? What then does the prophetic look like in the post-soul moment, right? Arguably, prior to Dr. King, this image of the prophetic, even on our flyer for this evening, there was a sense of shared interest that Anthea directed us to in her initial comments, right? Now, in a post-soul moment, in a post-civil rights moment, competing interests, diversification, class divide, what does the prophetic look like in that milieu?
Let me just really say really quickly, and I just really want to say there are three different sorts of points that animate the HuffPost piece, right? First is a historiographical claim that we've got to wrap our minds around, that the histories of African American religion have been dominated by liberal religious modernist, or what we might call religious modernist accounts. So there's a reason why we tell the story of African American religion in a particular sort of way. We think about all those University of Chicago theses. We think about all of those folk who were particular kinds of historians and sociologists participating in particular kinds of networks, writing histories about African American churches and accounting for those that fell outside their bounds, right? Outside the bounds, right? So when we think about why we haven't told and why we're just now beginning to tell a thick story about African American fundamentalism, why we're now just beginning to tell a thick story about the cross-fertilization, right, of this very interesting religious development after the Scopes trial and how African Americans were deeply implicated in that. Has something to do with the kinds of stories we told about our religious communities that we're just beginning to break open. That story has been driven by a particular theological orientation with a set of particular normative claims about how churches ought to function. That's the first claim, right? Second thing is that we need to deal with the battle between Reverend Ike and Dr. King. Ike won on a certain level, right?
We're going to get there.
No, I'm not saying he won, but I'm being dramatic, provocative, right? It's like that moment in Car Wash when Daddy Rich is coming to get his shoes shined, and the man who shines his shoes, and sitting behind him are images of Dr. King and Daddy Rich, right? It gives us a kind of complexity. Prosperity gospel isn't new. Du Bois talked about it in 1903. We know it was Prophet Jones. We can just begin to start. Wallace Best's piece, a recent piece in Huffington Post, gives us a sense of the complexity of this moment.
Right.
So part of what has to happen is really a kind of fundamental understanding that we've told ourselves a story that flattens the complexity, that the myth is in fact a myth, but it has real consequences in how we think about black church functioning. That's the first claim with a whole bunch of subsets. The second claim is that prophetic energy cannot be inherited, in my view. People have to, you just can't be, I'm raised in the church by definition. I have prophetic energy, I have the prophetic voice in me. No, I want to suggest that that the prophetic voice has to be found in the place where one's feet rest. And what is required in this moment is not so much a kind of recitation of the power of the black church, qua black church. What is required is a reimagining, an insistence on its relevance in relation to current problems. So when those folk in the context of the Great Migration reimagined the church, when King pushed out of the pulpit but insisted on we have a moment that requires us not simply to just hearken back to a tradition. We have to step, and so to give it content is to prescribe. What I want to suggest is just open up space so that people can give voice to what it can be and to what it perhaps is.
So that's, if we could respond to that, how do we give voice to the prophetic in this moment? How do you all give voice in your work, in your ministries, to our pastors as well? What does the prophetic look like in a post-civil rights moment?
Well, let me say, I think that very fundamentally, and Eddie, your points are a good one, and notwithstanding your points, I think that much more fundamental to the whole enterprise is a question of whether we really have given serious weight and consideration to prophetic discourse in our church discourses. There are many people who in church, when they hear you talk about prophetic, they think you're talking about foretelling. Have no idea that the major part of prophetic discourse is forthtelling, is indicting the powers that be. So I think the first step is to try to make this a normative part of our discourse, and that this is an important moment, and it's not just left up to the Martin Luther Kings. It's important that all of us know how basic the call to be on the lookout for opportunities to do justice or situations that call for justice to be done, how fundamental that is to our faith. I think that's the first step. Now we can talk about how does this look, and I think that's really important, but until that becomes a much more important part of our discourse, it's going to be fragmented. We're going to have people, I won't mention names, we're going to have pastors like one who's very much discredited in this moment, but he is a prosperity preacher, and he's saying a whole lot of crazy stuff, yet he can talk about taking on the mantle of Martin Luther King, and there's no hue and cry because the prophetic is not part of. You want to mention that? I'm not going to say his name. I'm not going to, because it's not
It's a broader issue. It's not just about.
It's not just about this person. No, because that's a long way away. So I'm not going to say that. But you see my point.
That current issue. That's part of a broader set of questions and how we imagine.
But until we do that, it's going to be fragmented. And we're going to have folk thinking that they are being prophetic, and when they're talking about taking on king's mantle, when they're doing a whole lot of foolish, a whole lot of performative stuff, it's a whole lot of prosperity gospel stuff. It's a whole lot of getting people, making people think it's about, what do you think? It's about praising with your lips all the time and forgetting about what you do with your limbs. If it's not doing the holy dance, then it doesn't matter.
It makes sense, though. It makes sense because to appropriate the image of Dr. King fits within Americanization. And,
yeah, that's true.
And the appropriate, that's why Reverend Ike fits with an American narrative so well. That's why prosperity gospel fits with an American. The prophetic narrative does not fit with the American ideal. So the prosperity gospel and Donald Trump, P. Diddy, and everybody else, they have the same narrative. And the prophetic narrative, when it is truly prophetic, does not fit within the mythos of America.
That's why it must be proclaimed by us as
right.
part of our normative practice.
Right, and any person who has made that proclaim, you're always a remnant. So you are always turned out by your own people.
Absolutely.
So you go to Riverside and you say, I'm going to speak out against the war, a speech that could be used today, just change some figures. And you are turned out by your best friends who say that I can no longer support you because you are supposed to be a local civil rights leader, not dealing with a poor people's campaign. You are turned out by your own people when you become radicalized, i.e. Du Bois. And so that the prosperity narrative, which we're giving a lot of energy to, is very American. The prophetic narrative is always going against the mythos of America. And anytime you go against the mythos of America, you have to raise the question, are you willing to be killed as a result of it? Not necessarily physically, but your ministry, who you are, your teaching, you will be assassinated in some form or fashion just for taking a position. And the reason I know this because our church was assassinated because of prophetic stands that we take as a result of that. Just because someone of color was going to go on the white, I don't think they could find on him was, well, we'll find a message from your minister, which is a whole other thing. But that becomes the particular narrative. The prophetic narrative demands a spiritual life, an interior and exterior, that raises the question, a question fundamentally of love. How does everyone live out their full humanness as a child of God? And the texts that we borrow from, not just the gospel, but the texts that we borrow from are also texts that come out of our collective narrative as African people. A narrative that demands space. Let me give you an example, simple story of an older woman who had several children. One child was same gender loving. Another child was made some money on Wall Street. Another child I think was divorced or something of that nature. Well, the children came home, and there was some fundamentalism in the mind of the Wall Street guy. And he did not want this same gender-loving brother at the same table. And so they're all arguing about the table, saying who could be at the table, this, that, and the other, till Mama stood up and said, you must understand, first off, it's my table and you're in my house. And you are all my children. Don't you ever put someone out of my house because you have a right to sit at the table. You didn't make the food. You didn't create the house. You are privileged to be in this house. Now, I don't care if y'all don't get along, but when you're in my house, you're at least going to struggle in dialogue. And that becomes the best image of what we struggle as in terms of a community. Drawing from, and again, that Hurston narrative, I draw from Hurston, because she gives so much black theology in what she does, because she deals with the folk religion that many in the academy we diss as being minstrel. She says the sanctified church. Let me tell you about High John the Conqueror, that actually gives information of how we live out as human beings. And that becomes a challenge for us. Can we actually get back to a center of a culture
other narratives, and then again going back to this love ethic that becomes central to who we are supposed to be.
I just really quickly, Otis, I was just thinking as you were laying out that powerful story about mama slapping beneath her. And a raisin in the sun. Popped her right in the face. You will, as long as you in my house, you will believe in. I remember James Baldwin's stepfather asking him, was the boy saved? And James Baldwin said he was Jewish, and the father popped him in the mouth. So we have to be careful when we invoke traditions because they contain within them disciplining mechanisms that police the boundaries of expression.
But they also have
I'm
a narrative of love, too.
That's what I'm saying.
Yes.
I'm just saying, let's put them side by side.
We keep it together, but they also have a narrative of love.
Anthea, you've been waiting for a little while.
Yeah, I just want to really point out one very big thing. When we talk about the prophetic, it is always this notion that we have to immediately go to king or to something else. Can somebody be prophetic that's sitting in a storefront church with 20 people?
Right.
Hello.
I mean, can we have the prophetic without it being a figure? Because you see, what I think is happening, and this problem with, the black church, put in the quotation mark, is that because these voices that are prophetic are not heard anymore. See, it was the problem with Jeremiah Wright. When you say "goddamn America," nobody had heard that in so long, it freaked everybody out. And then it was on you heard it at your church. You heard it, but nobody else. But even black people were like, "Oh my God,"
Not Chicago.
and not Chicago, but everywhere else they were. Do you know what I'm saying? So this voice has not been heard. And the second part is that if you're going to be prophetic, it is not about individual sin.
That's the point.
Okay?
Right.
This is about the corporate thing. Right. It's about all y'all, like we say in Texas. Not just one, but all y'all. This is where we're at. Everybody. This thing is wrong. So for me, when I start to think about what would be prophetic right now, it would be really prophetic if like a bunch of black churches got together and said, we need to get out of this damn war. How many black men and women we got fighting over there? Can we get out of this war? Can we just back out of this thing? See, nobody wants to be prophetic because we finally have a black president, and nobody don't want to call him out neither.
Because they worry about access.
Okay, so I'm going there. Okay, I'm going there tonight.
I want my picture.
So this is the thing. We are so happy to have him that we will let him do whatever he wants to do, and maybe that's not right.
But we let Bush do whatever he wanted.
Yeah, that's right. We did too. And you know how they let Bush do whatever they want to do? Because they took payoffs.
Well, but at the same time, when the church is
Anthony's been waiting patiently for a moment. Did you?
Well, to Dr. Butler's point, I mean, when we talk about being post-civil rights, that can be confusing to so many, right? Because chronologically, yes, we are a post-civil rights movement, and yet we really are not post-black freedom. When we look to what's happening on the micro level in our communities and how we are disproportionately represented in just about every negative statistic that there is, we are still enslaved to a lot. And so how can we be prophetic then? How are we prophetic, to your question, in light of what's happening not necessarily in Raisin in the Sun, not necessarily in Hurston's novels, but what's happening right here on our streets, in the homes of the people that we serve. And so to recognize, again, just using the language post-civil rights, that while chronologically we are still engaged in a black freedom movement, even as a black man sits in the White House.
So can I just, man, please just say this. I just want to say it and get it out. So much of the problem is that our churches are so ensconced and mired in the performative. Everything is a daggone performance. And so much energy is put into the performance every Sunday. There's so little energy put into social resources. There's so much energy, so many resources that are squandered, and that are lost. So we want to talk about, it's not about people getting payoffs as much, directly as much as the payoff comes from folk are having a whole lot of fun and talking about how deeply spiritual calling the church and coming out not transformed, just changing the way they feel for a couple of days, then they got to go back and re-up again. Now, come on, let's get to it.
All right. I want to bring in a question. We can think of the performative as both a blessing and a curse, if we will, and more complicated, right?
Well, yeah.
But I want to bring in a question from the audience, and the microphone, just so you know, the cordless mic is not working, so that's why I'm raising these. But someone in our audience and several point to this question as a particular concrete issue that you all are calling black churches to deal with is the question of class. So where are black churches in the economic crisis, right? Soledad reimagined her documentary to focus on debt, right? Many of you have pointed to questions of wealth or lack thereof and these disparities across society. Where are black churches on, and I'm not saying they're not anywhere, I'm asking where are they concretely, how are black churches dealing with the class reality in this post-civil rights era and the particularities of the more recent economic recession?
Well, I want to try and kind of get at that in two different ways. One is that when we talk about the black church and the work of the black church and all of the overshadowing of those things that we consider to be negative, which is true, I agree with all that. But what is tragic is that when you do have people who are coming together, as we've had 300 churches came together, stand against the war, 300 churches dealing with this issue of poverty, they don't get the mic. They don't get the mic at all. And it's so challenging. No one wants to talk with them when they take a prophetic stand. And the reality is the prophetic is always a remnant. They are always on the margin. And we would love it to be the center, but if it becomes the center, then somebody else is going to have to critique it from the margin if it becomes the center. But the prophetic has always been. And so the issue of class is one of the issues that the church has challenges with because it's so Americanized.
Yes.
So we still have churches that are certain colors, certain classes, you have to have certain degrees to be a part of, all of that. And some of the amazing work is really going on in storefront churches, people who will never come into Union Theological Seminary because they are dealing with the issue of poverty on a day-to-day basis in a very real way. Children who just are straight up hungry. They can't learn because their bellies ache. But within a privileged church, which many people have attended, a privileged church, those are stories that you see on television or you hear from the pulpit.
Yes.
Speaking from the perspective of Abyssinian Baptist Church, which is often looked upon as, to use Reverend Moss's language, a privileged church, I just want to push back a little bit on that because those are not just stories for many of us. We actually are a congregation that is interclass, although you wouldn't necessarily know it from the outside. We are a congregation that is made up of those who are poor and those who are very rich. And we all come together. And in the context of our ministry, we are touching hands-on the flesh and blood realities of the community around us through not only, the development corporation as an institutional entity, but through the folk in the pews who actually, clothe those who are naked, who actually feed those who are hungry. And so I don't want to, although we recognize that many black churches and many churches are set apart just by the mere privilege of having a sanctuary, right, are set apart from those who are really the oppressed of the oppressed, even though that is factual. There are those contexts wherein you have persons who are really touching those flesh and blood realities. And so I don't want to discount
Absolutely. I think that we need to wrap our minds around some just fundamental shifts that are taking place in the nature of African American church landscapes. We're seeing in interesting sorts of ways, and I know, Fred, you talked about this, is we're seeing the disappearance in interesting sorts of ways of the neighborhood church. Churches and their organic relationship to the folks who live around them. In fact, if a church actually hasn't moved out into a suburban area and stays in, most of the people who attend the church actually come from someplace else to go to the church. R. Drew Smith has done some wonderful work in regards to those pastors who are progressive, who stay in their neighborhoods, and the relationship actually to the community that's out there, the skepticism of folk in the neighborhood vis-a-vis the church, where the church resides. So this is really complicated in a number of different ways, how the very ways in which church life have been constituted under these very unique conditions, how the demographics are placing certain pressures on the very ways in which churches function, right? And then I want to be very clear too, right? We can talk about general trends, even as we want to lift up what particular churches are doing. We need to be able to offer general descriptions of a problematic. If we want to say that black men are disproportionately being incarcerated and someone says, but my brother isn't, that doesn't impact the fact itself, right? So part of what we want to say is that there are churches that are doing extraordinary work, that are churches that are interclassed, but what we're seeing are all sorts of pressures that are impacting the very demographics of churches and who sits in those pews and where they're located.
And I just want to take off on what A said just a second and say, and twist this another way and ask the class question a different way. Who is moving from one class to another because of this economic situation? Now, I've been watching Memphis, Tennessee. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, there are over 20 foreclosed black churches in Memphis right now that have had to close their doors. Now, what does that mean? That has already changed the demographic of that city. If you've got people who have lost their jobs and if they've been in these churches and the church has lost their home and they've lost their home, then they went from maybe lower middle class or middle class to poverty. Okay? So this is another thing that's really happening. So we can ask that class question, but we've got to ask it a different way about how people are moving. And what this is doing is there's going to be, I got to quote this figure that Professor Harris gave me, and I was just stunned, but this is so sad. The average net worth of a white woman in this country is like something like $43,000, something like that. How much? Single white woman, yes. Single white woman. This is a woman who's not married, doesn't have anything. $43,000. Do you know what the net worth of a black woman is in this country? $5. $5. That was stunning. Stunning. Who is sitting in the churches? Black women. So once we begin to start to think about this in some different ways and start to not just talk about this in a religious way, but to look at the economics and everything else, this is serious.
Yeah, this class question is a very important question, and just as sort of an addendum, that is one of the things that prophetic discourse brings to the fore. Questioning the systemic configurations, the way society is set up, institutional configurations, asking questions about why are some people poor, some people rich, questioning capitalism, and that, of course, presupposes taking some extra energy in our churches to do more reading and more study. But something that impressed me, one of the times I spoke at J. Alfred Smith's church out in Oakland, and I noticed when it came time for the announcements, and I was waiting to hear someone say, giving honor to God, and we having a bake sale, and nothing's wrong with that because I love the bake sales, but instead they got up and started reading, telling people about what was going on politically, what was going on in the community, the things they should be aware of, the issues they might contemplate. And they were upholding that prophetic responsibility to raise people's consciousness to look at questions of class. So many black people, we know that what happened with this subprime mortgage thing is terrible, but so many of our people don't have a real sense of what happened and why it happened. Why aren't we questioning? Why don't we know that anyone who fights for radical deregulation, they're fighting against regulatory protections for the average person, and this is not consistent with the biblical witness. I don't care what the conservatives say. But these kinds of things don't come up because prophetic discourse is not normative, and because it's not normative, we don't understand that these questions of class are questions that we can and should be asking. That's why I keep pressing it, and that's why I keep saying that's the largest lacuna, I think, in our community, that and this notion of holistic spirituality that moves us to a certain point that says of spirituality and spiritual attainment that to the point that we can't help but love our neighbor as ourselves and want to change circumstance for our neighbors as we like them changed for our own loved ones.
If we shift our attention from the question of class to something that's already been put on the table, but if we address it more substantively about applying this love ethic that we're all appealing to, how does this get mobilized? And there's an interest in the audience in talking about what Aubrey suggested and what Otis encouraged him to make plain, the more recent Eddie Long scandal. But rather than directing I said it, right? But rather than having our conversation be overdetermined by an individual, recognizing that this implicates a broader gender and sexual politic that is not just about black churches, but about religion, gender, and sexuality more broadly. How do we think about strategies for mobilizing this love ethic? Or what can we expect reasonably of black churches in terms of engaging their own sexual and gender politics?
You know I got my mouth fixed up because I got a lot to say. No offense to the pastors on board with me, but you know, the first thing you have to do is when your pastor messed up, you got to love them enough to sit them down. It's always been very interesting to me as somebody who does American religion to look at white evangelicals, and the moment that a white evangelical messes up, they throw them out the door. Or they got to go sit down somewhere and go to a camp or go to reconditioning or something. You know, or you going to Betty Ford or you going to the sex clinic or something else. In a black church, if a pastor messes up and it's just heterosexual, hallelujah. We're going to keep, you know, it might be a bad Sunday with somebody sweating up there for a couple of hours or something and somebody gets called out. But that person can stay in the pulpit. There is no retribution for bad behavior. It's got to stop. You know, I'm not from a black church. I'm the Catholic Church. I'm on them every day about the mess that they've perpetrated. But you see, we've got this same thing right now, black churches all across the country, so I'm going to start laying it out for you. If you go on the web right now, you can look at a website for the Church of God in Christ where all the sex scandals have been and how much they are having to pay out to all these people who are suing. There's a big suit today in Dallas that just came up. There's a lot of stuff going on, people. See, it ain't one church. It's a lot of them. And a lot of these churches are having these issues. What do? Well, one thing is to start talking about sexuality in a different way. You can't just use sexuality to get people in the door because you're selling sex. No more sheets. The lady, the lover, and her Lord. All this stuff. People use sex to sell their sermons. And then they won't tell you when you come in the door, you can't do nothing. What about that? I mean, this is double messages going on all the time. It's ridiculous. So instead of messing around, everybody's laughing, it's the truth. I mean, you know, it's a pastor in Memphis that had a bed up there at the church. Talking about this is how you're supposed to please your spouse. Yeah, that's ridiculous. That's right. People, I didn't come to church for porn. You get that at home. See, I'm just saying it. But this is the problem. It's like the Destiny's Child song. It's no, 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 no from the pulpit when everybody really saying yeah, 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 yeah. It's got to stop. This messing around with this, it's not serious. But this is a serious issue. The homophobia, the stuff that comes out of some people's pulpits about gay folks, and people sitting up there right in the congregation. Why would you sit there and let somebody take you on like that? Walk out the door. Don't give that person your money. Don't give that church your money. These are the things, this is, you know, I'm being very glib about this, but I'm not really glib. I'm really grieved because it is something that is tearing our churches apart. And if you look in places like Georgia and other places where, you know, who has HIV the most? African-American women. So this is taking a toll, and we cannot afford to be light about this anymore. We just can't. It's time to clean house. And if, you know, if the people won't do it, somebody else will.
If I could, just to tweak this in terms of thinking of strategies, right? Anthea has just invited, as many churches are doing the work of offering a more inclusive sexual ethic. I give the example of someone that I've worked with who took a church that he and his wife co-pastored. He and his wife are co-pastors through the process of becoming open and affirming. And in the process, he coined a term called straight flight, right? So the same consequences of what Otis, you suggested if we take a prophetic stance on the war. Right? So how does, in the face of that reality, how do we negotiate strategies for putting that forward?
Oh, I know how to do that.
Well, and Otis,
No, go ahead, Otis.
Well, within the context of Trinity, with a church that has a same-gender loving community in that church, and as a result, there was straight flight. Now, my predecessor spent years teaching this idea of love and raised a fundamental question. He preached on it. And the fundamental question that he raised and then raised within biblical context, because one of the things that is a little bit different about Trinity is that we actually have professors from seminary that teach our Bible study classes, so that you can even get credit to graduate from Virginia Union if you want, through some of the classes that we offer at Trinity in connection with several of the partnerships that we do. And so the fundamental question that he put forth, which I thought was incredibly powerful, was if you take the position of, you know, going to hell, sin, and all that kind of stuff, would God intentionally make someone, design someone just to go to hell? Would God intention, and that was the fundamental theological question to jump off from there. So now let's discuss it from there. The second thing is that there is a rise in homophobia that was not as prevalent previous to the rise of the fundamentalist movement, specifically with the Southern Baptist Church. There was, because ethical reasoning is determined by relationship. And so within the South, there was a position previous to the 60s and 70s where if you were to make a statement in small communities from the pulpit, you could get sat down as pastor. Reason being is because everyone had, and this exactly happened with my first pastorate, where a gentleman who was transgender died, who happened to be the local florist in the community. And there was a deacon. It was just like, we can't have this funeral. He's this, that, and the other. And to see all of these elder, quote, straight men stand up and say, you don't understand. When my mother died, he was there. And I will show my respect, and you will not disrespect him. Second thing was, he's been in this church longer than you. And that was one of the most powerful moments to see a Southern community to say that we don't have all of the theological language, but we do understand that we're in relationship with each other. And that becomes a jumping off point of building the fundamental relationship with people. We love doctrine. We don't like love.
Can I ask you a question, Reverend Moss? I'm just interested because it's interesting to talk about relationship, but I also think that black people have a relationship to the Bible. That, and we can say doctrine, but let's say what it really is. It's really Bible, and how you read it.
It's not the same thing.
But a particular
It's a particular
of,
reading.
Right.
It's a particular reading. So I'm just curious because I'm not going to tell on this person, but somebody said, while you all are talking about all this Eddie Long thing, just don't get into the Bible stuff, because if you get into the Bible stuff, then you're going to have all these churches getting on you, because, as long as the Bible is not contested about what to say about homosexuality, then this is the case. And so I'm really wondering about how to deal with that dichotomy, because for those of us in the academy who, have some ways to want to talk about this, it's one thing. But when you're in a church, it's another thing.
Well, we teach a hermeneutic of suspicion.
Yeah.
We do that. And, if Howard Thurman's mother can do it,
Yeah.
Howard Thurman's mother said, you know what? I like Jesus. I got an issue with Paul.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
anything he says, I ignore. She had a hermeneutic of a suspicion. She said, Jesus is my model.
Yeah.
I can deal with that. But as soon as Paul says be silent, I'm not being silent for nobody.
But I do wonder, though, that's her, but there's so many other people who won't argue with that. How do you deal with that from the pulpit? Because that's my question, my fundamental question is because, I can walk off and go back, to pen any day. But what the real issue is going to be is how does this happen if we are going to change these conversations in our churches? You've got a good way to do this because you've got training. But for most churches, they don't have that. How does that conversation happen?
Well, and I use that Southern narrative again, is that churches, which was fascinating to me, in these, when my first pastorate in Augusta, Georgia, and then having to go to these small Southern communities, I couldn't understand why Atlanta could be so homophobic, but yet Blackville, South Carolina was not. And it was a very interesting dichotomy. Now, they were not there's a continuum. They're not way over here, not way over there, just somewhere in the middle. But there was a different ethic, and I think that ethical reasoning based on relationship, because it became very difficult for certain individuals to make certain statements. It's easy in the urban context, in a broad context, I can do that. But when you have to look someone in the eye every day, because there's only 1,100 people in the town anyway, and 10% of them, more than likely, may be same-gender loving. And so, you're raising these particular questions. And I heard that from many older ministers, usually women, who raise that question, that really pastoring is not a fatherly model, but it's a motherly model.
And also, in just a more concrete way, Dr. Butler, that's one reason why I do actually find it important to, while we speak in generalizations and look at broad statistics, to also highlight the exceptions. Because when you, the exceptions to the rule, because when you ask a question like that, how do these smaller churches who may not have access to seminary learning or a more progressive model of ministry, how will they communicate liberation? How will they communicate God's expansive love, God as exclusive inclusivity rather, to their congregation, and through relationship with other churches who may be the exceptions? There is a cross-fertilization where through the preached word and through teaching, that learning can happen in spaces that are not normative spaces. And so, again, I think that here in Harlem, there are smaller conventions of churches, as in other places as well. So your storefront church will get together with a larger congregation for a week at a time, where there is study, where there is preaching, where there is dialogue and communication. And it's in those contexts, I think, and hopefully there are others, but at least on the micro level, where that exchange to relationship can begin to happen.
Did any?
I do. Yeah, it's very important. I think really quickly about just a couple quick points. One is with regard to why ministers are allowed to get away with so much often. Is that because we can confuse what is a role with a status, and the ministry becomes a status. And we also make personality cults around ministers. And so because they have a different status, they are judged a different way. And they have their catchphrases that that support that, something, they'll quote something from the Psalm that has nothing to do with the context, but it'll be, touch not the head of my anointed. And the other thing is that when we talk, because there is a dearth of a real tradition of interiority, you can become a pastor with no spiritual attainment at all. And I know a few of them. That they just, it's mercantile, and it is a good job that allows them to be, it allows them to be James Brown at least once a week. And of course, I mean, that's I mean, there are many who are wonderful. I mean, and I'm not generalizing, but we all know that's the case. They say it loud too, man. They can dance and jump and sweat just like Jane. But in terms of teaching, if we focus on, we have to have something that's normative, and it must be the gospel, in my opinion. I mean, the gospel writings. And if we look at the gospel writings, a lot of our excursions into doctrinal minutiae and cul-de-sacs and irrelevancies would not happen. Now, with regard to homosexuality, I think one way that's easy to teach, that if we look at the teaching of Jesus, Jesus gave one primary way to judge people in Matthew 25. He says, as you have not done it to the least of these, you have not done it unto me. As you have fed, as you have clothed, as you looked out for those who are really in need, then you've done it to me. But to the extent that you have not, you haven't done it to me. And then it ends by saying, and then off you go to hell. This is only really the primary judgment that Jesus gives. Now, if we use that mode of judgment, I did a C-SPAN special for the Center for American Progress, hour and a half on my book, The Politics of Jesus. It was lovely for me. I hope other people enjoyed it, but I certainly did. And in it, someone asked this question, the same question. And I said, well, wait a minute. If we take Jesus seriously, how can I possibly... I had a colleague at Drew University when I was in the faculty there, wonderful man in every kind of way, godly man in every kind of way, and I didn't know he was gay for the first year and a half we were in the faculty. It didn't matter. But how can I take someone like Dick Cheney, because he's heterosexual, how can I value him over someone who is loving, who does justice, who fulfills Matthew 25, but he just happens to love another one of God's creatures who are his same gender? How can I possibly do that? So, if we, again, go to the prophetic witness of the Gospels themselves as something normative and stop all these flights of fancy and all this foolishness, because if we did that, we wouldn't have the prosperity gospel, we wouldn't have all this madness, we wouldn't have Leroy Thompson talking about money, come here, money, from the pulpit. That must be normative to us. That's why I continue to stress it. That's not just because I'm a biblical scholar, but I think it's because it shows that Jesus' teachings were relational and not doctrinal. He didn't teach much of anything about what to believe, but everything about how to live and how to treat others.
Now, I want to go back to Professor Butler's point. Oh.
Just really quickly, I just think it's... I was having a conversation with the great Jim Forbes recently, and he said that we ought to perhaps include as a part of licensing, right, that pastors commit themselves to ongoing counseling.
Right.
That's the first. I think it's a brilliant idea, because they're human beings. They're just like we all are, cracked and messed up, trying to figure out how to walk this journey with some sense of decency in the short time that we have. Second point, really quickly, is that we got to figure out how to have conversations within church spaces about sexuality and sexual desire without it being framed by negative acts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The fact that the accusations around Bishop Long frame the predatory act are framing our discussion around sexuality.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Truncates how we think about sexuality. And so I think it's important for us to disentangle the TMZ story That is Bishop Long. And the horrors that are associated with those young brothers who have had to deal with what they've had to deal with. From this broader question of how we imagine ourselves as God's children who desire other God's children, other children of God.
Yes, yes.
And we got to do that in a way that is not framed negatively, but positively.
Yes.
And then maybe we can get someplace. And some people are doing that.
Yeah,
I want to
just a
listen.
little small. I'm just curious, and I heard this from, it was a white Pentecostal minister not too long ago, because when you mentioned about the issue of sexuality, why don't we sit people down? He made a statement that just kind of blew me away. I'm trying to remember the gentleman's name, but it doesn't make a difference who it was. But he said that black churches, you can get away with any type of sexual, quote unquote, indiscretion, but don't mess with the money. In white churches, you can mess with the money and stay, and but any particular sexual indiscretion, you gone. And he says that there is a different way that these communities view issues of sexuality, and also for a community that has not had enough, because if you really want to get removed from a black church quickly, just mess with someone's money, and there will be a physical fight very quickly. I think there is some history behind that we need to, somebody needs to do some research around. I would be curious around those particular, why is it that we are so permissive when someone is utilizing the congregation as their own personal dating service?
Oh, hello. Brothel.
Or a brothel, maybe one of the other.
I don't even think it's dating.
Yeah, but I was being nice.
Want to offer up a couple of questions, try to fuse them together from the audience. One is the question of what are the responsibility of black churches to not be defined solely by serving a racial group in this moment, right? So so this is a question, but also to tie that to the question of the reality of religious diversity. Right? So whether it's the long stories told about the Nation of Islam, but the increase, with the increase of West African Muslims, even here in Harlem, how do we think about the broader religious landscape of Black America and the role of black churches in engaging in conversation? So where does interfaith and interracial conversation show up in what we're talking about as the present and future reality of black churches?
Well, I'm minded to think about, and I don't know if it was this past Sunday or it's this coming Sunday. I'm sorry if I missed this, but there's going to be a group of African churches that are going to Washington to pray for America, which I thought was fascinating, okay? And the reason why I think this is fascinating is because within the midst of us, we have all these immigrant churches from the diaspora. Right. And so when we sit here and we talk about black church, it leaves out this whole space of people that are around us, especially in the urban space and where I live in Philadelphia. So I've got not only, immigrant churches, I also have a huge Muslim community there. And I'm not sure yet, because I'm still new to Philly, what is happening there on the ground for people to speak back and forth to each other. But I do think that is a creative way to start to think about how to talk about the first thing I brought up, which is community. What is community comprised of? Are we only talking about Christian communities? Or are we talking about something broader? I think we have to start, especially if we're going to do if I think about Malcolm X, especially, if we're going to do anything about thinking about the diaspora and what is happening in the diaspora and some of the same issues that people are facing. Otherwise, we're going to have to reach across lines interreligiously in order to make a broader kind of community so that we can have some movement back and forth.
I think we need to stop talking so much about being Christians and start focusing more on our common humanity. Stop focusing so much on doctrinal division and start focusing on we focus again on the example of Jesus in the Gospels. He stressed how we should live and treat one another. And if we focus on that, I think that will open all kinds of room for for ecumenical activities in the real sense. And the reason I say that because too many Christians take too much pride in being Christians. And when we take too much pride in being one thing, that's tantamount to placing a value judgment on being something else. Not only that, we need to sit down, and so I think we need to interrogate what it really means to be a Christian, and really interrogate that. And I think if we do that, that'll open up room to talk to other people. We also need to ask others, find out why others believe what they believe, and not just discount them as the other and leave them as the other, but look at the commonality. But then again, that comes to looking at the prophetic witness of Jesus in the Gospels, being serious about reading them. Then we'll see that it's mostly about ethical behavior, how we live in the world. The kingdom of God is relational. We take that seriously about building a new heaven and a new earth. That means embracing all of humanity, not just other folk who call themselves what we call ourselves. And that also means that we take a different notion, get a different sense of what it means to be saved. Because in the Old Testament sense, it means to be delivered, but it means to be delivered from certain kinds of conditions. And when we say that we are saved and others are not, then we construct this box around ourselves, and we can end up looking down on people in our same churches. Well, they ain't saved. And you know what I'm talking about. So I'm going to leave that alone, because you can imagine many times people ask me if I'm saved, and my response is, none of your business. Why would you even ask?
I think often for congregations, what prohibits or ecumenical dialogue and interracial dialogue is fear. Because, again, when we think about the Christian narrative, Christian triumphalism, which I think Dr. Hendricks was pointing toward, is synonymous with American triumphalism. And so what we see of the other in the media, in those spaces that are hyper accessible to our congregations, is predominantly negative of that which is other than what we are as American. And so the Muslim or Islam becomes a site of fear. And the other, African traditional religions, becomes a site of fear for our congregations. And so I think that in order to really begin to encourage this kind of dialogue and community amongst differences, it has to be preached from the pulpit. The people, in large part, the only continuing education most of our congregations get is on Sunday morning. And so we have to be able to put it in a way that is palatable for the audiences for the people that we serve. But going back quickly to this point about male normativity, I think that until we really are serious about looking at that and inquiring about how that affects our communities, then all of our prophetic tendencies to move forward are going to be compromised because we start from a place automatically where we believe that humanity has to be synonymous or equate with a certain kind of embodied normativity. And so anyone who is outside of that normativity is, runs the risk of being subhuman or non-human. So why even engage with them? Okay. Why not oppress them? So
we have about 10 minutes left, and I want to try to synthesize a couple of questions into one that might allow each of you to offer some final remarks of about 2 minutes or so. Several questions in the audience. Want to make sure that we address how black churches are addressing the generation gap. Hip-hop, civil rights, the kind of prominent media image of black youth as super predators. Where are black churches in this discourse? And if I could open that up to the broader generational question, there's been a larger discussion about megachurches, televangelism, prosperity gospel as somehow at the same time of this generational shift, as evidence of the decline of a true black church tradition that we've all dismissed, but still refer to it as such. So if we frame that along lines of this generational access, what is the significance of new media and technologies in terms of this conversation about black youth, but in terms of the contemporary landscape of black churches? What role do new medias and technologies, I know many of you write on the internet, show up on television, on the radio, what have you, what do these new medias and technologies play the role, how do they play a role in addressing the generational divide, if we agree that there is one?
I think there is one just because of the age of people in lots of congregations. I mean, you just can't get past the fact that there's a gap, okay? So if we acknowledge that, then the issue becomes, if you are used to being on Facebook and Twitter, and you get your church gossip from somebody's blog, and you can watch your favorite pastor on that, I don't know if it's not streaming the Word Network, it's Daystar, Dayspring, wherever it is, that streams it live. Why do you even need to go somewhere?
Right.
This is a big question. And so I think what churches will have to face now is that it makes it a lot harder to get somebody in the pew that has access to all these things and using them in certain kinds of ways. It's not that older people don't use them, they just use them in different ways. So I really do think this presents a very big issue. But the other issue that I sort of alluded to that I think is a really interesting thing for me that I'm personally tracking is how many people are on blogging about their church or their denomination or that particular gospel following they have. And that creates a whole nother kind of space. And I don't know if anybody has really started to look at this in terms of African-American religion or African-American churches. But I think it is an important part of what's happening right now because things move a lot faster than they used to. So the good and the bad is out there living on the internet in perpetuity. And so that makes it very interesting about what happens with churches and what kinds of churches have life and the ones that may not have life.
Mm-hmm. You know, I think one of the problems we have that with some mega churches, and I say some because I've spoken and taught at Trinity, and it's a huge congregation, and it's one of the most loving congregations I've experienced, and people know each other. And I don't know how you know so many names, but it's extraordinary. And mega churches can have a sense of community in that you follow like the class cell setting of the AME church is supposed to follow, where there's everybody, the whole congregation is broken down into groups of 12 with a class leader. It's sort of a cell, and there's always someone to look after you, to be in touch with. And so a huge church can have a small church feel, and some of that is what goes on there. But one of the problems we have is that in too many churches, because they are so large, they are we have audiences rather than congregations. And audience in the sense that they are performed to, and not really fed in the sense of the kind of nourishment that Eddie talked about, spiritual nourishment Eddie talked about earlier. And with regard to young people, it's really problematic because Kirk Franklin made a statement about 10 years ago in Vibe magazine. He said, "I am the holy dope dealer, and Jesus rock or crack is a drug I'm dealing, and it'll give you a high like you've never had before." And the problem with that is if you attract young people to the church with that kind of performance orientation, you say, well, they're about hip hop, so we'll make it hip hop. But if you attract them to that, that's what they're coming to. And so how can you can say we get them there, we'll give them something different. But if people come there for that kind of performance, they're almost usually given nothing else. The question is, we can get them in there, but then again, what are we giving them when we get them in there, and what does that mean in the final in the final run, and ultimately for our churches and for our society in terms of contribution we empower our young people to make through the churches?
I would say that in terms of the generational gap, first I want to say that there are young people in the church. There are. And yet we still see the generational gap. We still see this problem. And I would say two things. One, that there has to be a transformation of liturgy, liturgical presentation. Now, does that mean that you go full hip hop to the hip hop scholar? I don't know. I don't think so. But there has to be a space for young people to feel as if they are welcome and that they belong. In terms of media, yes, young people are very media driven and engage in the various social networks that are available to them. However, it's shocking how many young people I come across who will admit that they come to church for community. They actually come so they can touch and see, even amidst this E-driven society. And so I think that speaks to this notion of having to have a place for them where they can come, see, and touch and feel like their being there matters, that they are welcome in that space. And too many churches really don't welcome young people. And lastly, I would say that beyond the show, right? Beyond the fast preaching, fast talking, dancing, and all of that, singing, again, to this notion that people are coming to touch, to see, to feel, there has to be a re-evaluation of the ethic of care that goes forth in terms of pastoral ministry, right? So we have the priestly, the serving communion, the baptism, the preaching. We have the prophetic. But what about the pastoral?
Exactly.
And people need that. People need to know that they are seen, that someone cares.
Yes.
That someone is wondering about them when they are not there. And too often, the reality is, when they're not there, I'm glad they're not here this Sunday.
I think that there's always been a generation gap. There always has been generational conflict. The challenge for us today is that I think that you have many churches, if I may use the analogy of Mary and Elizabeth, that Mary, when she was pregnant with Jesus, she went to be with a seasoned saint by the name of Elizabeth. And the challenge is that when you have a church that is only centered on Elizabeth, or a church that is only ministering to Mary, you have a problem. You have a church that may have a lot of wisdom but no energy, or a church that has a lot of energy but no wisdom. And what happens when we now come to a moment in our community where we no longer have Mary and Elizabeth churches? Because I think it's a good thing. The emerging churches that are developing within our community, there are a lot of churches that are nurturing that Mary generation. And they do a tremendous job nurturing the Mary generation. Elise Barrymore in Chicago, a tremendous pastor in Chicago Heights, a very distressed community, but an emerging church. Phil Jackson, the House Church, that's on the west side of Chicago, very distressed community, but pretty much you're not going to find anybody over 32 in those churches, which means there is a gap in history and in theology that is problematic. There needs to be an Elizabeth, and there is a gap when you have a church that everybody is Elizabeth. And they have no one. So that becomes, I think, the fundamental challenge. But as a post-soul or postmodern church, I think that the pillars of hip-hop should be instituted within the church. That I think that you should use rap or orality, technology, that's all that you're talking about when you're utilizing swiping, things of that nature, and dance and artistic aspects, which we call graffiti. When you begin to utilize those things, it is a new transformative liturgy, is what you're really talking about. And people are able to lead in those. Now, with the technology, one of the things that happens at Trinity, that Dr. Hendricks has been there to speak, and every Sunday we have 2,000 people who don't attend church but attend church. virtually. We have 2,000 people every single Sunday on top of everybody else. Some of them give, some of them complain. They do everything that regular church members do. And they're part of the life, and we have created a network, and that network that has been created by the 20-something ministry in our church. So they tweet, they blog, they do the Facebook piece, creating conversations around specific issues, and they mobilize. And so we also utilize it as a mobilizing tool because we're recognizing that there is such a deep hunger. I want to add this. There is a break that's happening in the young evangelical community where they are so tired of the personalized doctrines that are being presented as saying this is what it means to be Christian and this is how you practice it in civic society. That they're raising questions around poverty, around race, and around HIV, and they are now partnering with black churches, and they are now finding Dr. King as a model and Howard Thurman as a model, which is fascinating. That within 20 or so years, the traditional evangelical community that we think of will not exist anymore. It will be what they call red letter Christians. And for those who may not be familiar with the term, is that we're red letter Christians. You know, the stuff where Jesus says stuff in the red, that's what we believe. And they're operating out of that context, that we're red letter Christians. Shane Claiborne in Philadelphia is a gentleman who operates out of that red letter edition, where he connects with the African American community and says that there is a hunger for us to be connected in a prophetic way because we have always been boxed in the personal and the private. And we want to move out of that. And within the African American community, there is a hunger for how do I apply my living, my faith on a daily basis. I know how to shout. Show me how to serve. You know, I know how to praise. Tell me how to protest. I want to be able to operate with the cross. And if all you can do is one or the other, you have a stick and not a cross. And the challenge for this generation, I think, and for those who are nurturing is how do we build the kind of leadership development? Because we don't like young people taking hold of the mantle. We don't want them we want in the mini-me's. We want people that look just like us, speak like us, talk like us. They're not going to do it that way. And every movement, every organic development of anything in our community has always shown that when you infuse younger people, they will never operate the way you do. They will take the ethic of what is presented, but they will flip the script and go in a different way. And that becomes, I think, the fundamental challenge if the church is able to nurture another generation using the pillars of hip-hop and let Mary and Elizabeth work together so that we have power and wisdom in our churches.
Thank you, Otis. Eddie, you have a final word?
It's hard to follow that. And he's been talking that way since we were at Morehouse together. So it's very hard to follow. And I agree with every word that has been said. I think we need to understand African American churches as dynamic institutional spaces. We need to understand African American churches as dynamic institutional spaces. Those narratives that fix our conception of the church oftentimes do more harm than good. I'm just, as we were talking about hip hop, I was thinking about Tom Dorsey. I was thinking about when the drums came into the church. Right? And I was thinking about the kind of resistances, right, when that blues chord made its way. Right? Folks said, what was that? Right? And how the dynamism of worship, right, enabled this extraordinary creativity that's a part of a people who are trying to make sense of their living and do so in a joyous way, to become a part of their worship, their celebration of God, and their affirmation of His grace extended to them. If the church is dynamic, the way it changed under the context, as I said, of the Great Migration, the way it shifted in the context of this black freedom struggle of the 60s and 70s, how will it look in this moment? In this moment when so many young people suffer from post-traumatic syndrome, when so many of them have seen somebody that they love get shot and killed right in front of them. So many folk are walking around proclaiming their piety. So many folk are walking around saying how saved they are. And somebody right in front of them just needs a hug and an affirmation that they are children of God, but you're walking around showing your feathers. And I would like to say, by way of closing, that the intensity of my remarks has something to do with my own personal struggle, my own sense of God's grace extended to me, my own acceptance of stepping into the expansiveness of His love, and my sense of the newly converted being kind of zealous. So I say this by way of conclusion, that what I've heard tonight, it's relational, not doctrinal. That faith without love, can lead to Pharisees.
Has led to Pharisees.
Yeah. And what I would hope to do as I grow up in my own faith is to understand the power of the church and to take seriously Emerson's response to those young ministers at Harvard Divinity School, to insist that they not let their faith, their love of God, be atrophied by the noise and chatter of those who claim to know who God is.
Want to thank again our sponsors, the Institute for Research in African American Studies, the Institute for Religion, Culture, and Public Life, our host union. Thank you all for coming out this evening, for your wonderful questions, and let's give our panelists a final round of applause.